This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Hanna Holborn Gray, who served as president of the University of Chicago from 1978 through 1993, and now holds the title of President Emeritus and Harry Pratt Judson Distinguished Professor of History at that university. She's one of the most distinguished and accomplished leaders of American higher education and has received honorary degrees from over 60 colleges. She is a recipient of the Medal of Liberty in 1986 and the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1991. She is on the campus this semester as the Clark Kerr Lecturer. Dr. Gray, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Heidelberg, Germany. I was raised in New Haven, Connecticut. My parents came to America when I was not quite 4 years old.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
My parents were German academics who saw what was coming in the Hitler regime. My father was one of the first professors fired at the University of Berlin. And so my parents certainly had a tremendous impact on my thinking about politics, about the world of international affairs. As a child, I heard a great deal on those subjects from very early age indeed. And of course, they were tremendously interested in the 30s and what was going on in Europe. They were tremendously in favor of America's entering the war. And so it was particularly in those areas that substantively ideas that I had came from there. I think secondly, they influenced me in their emphasis on education and in wanting to be sure that I got a good education. And as a number of good Germans at that time tended to think, they were a little worried about whether American culture would contaminate me or whether whether I would decay intellectually, because what they saw of America they loved politically, and they loved the freedom that they came to have, but they were worried about American popular culture, and they were worried about their children losing their European heritage. And so they made sure that we read the classical literature of Europe as well as of America. They made sure that we got an excellent education, and they tended to emphasize education above all else.
And your father was a historian. We should
Yes, he was.
Tell us about him and his work.
My father was a historian who was trained in a very broad way, as people of his generation were in the German universities, so that among the fields that he covered were not only modern European history with an emphasis on modern Germany, but also Reformation history, the history of international relations, and also the philosophy of history, and he taught in all those fields. He was a relatively young man still when he came to the United States, and he'd already achieved a certain prominence, in part because he held a chair at Berlin that was financed by the Carnegie Corporation, and that brought him some British and American students. So he came to be known more widely than he might have been at that age, and in part because he was published very early. So he came to Yale University, and it was during the Depression, a time when it was difficult to find academic appointments, also a time when American universities sometimes worried about whether European emigres should be receiving appointments when American PhDs perhaps were having difficulty. But he gained tenure very quickly, and he made a tremendous difference to that university, and I think also to the study of modern European history in this country. He was among a group of people who had that kind of influence and who brought that kind of European background and that kind of approach to history to what had been somewhat more parochial history departments that had given less attention to European history and that were just in general somewhat more parochial. He had a lot of PhD students, and so many of his PhD students then went on to be professors elsewhere. And as you know, that's how professors have an influence.
Right. But he also, it would seem, just from what we've talked about with him, that to be an influential voice at a pivotal time when America was assuming global responsibilities and dealing with the situation in Europe.
I think he was not so much that in the 30s, but he was that after the war. During the war, he had been in the OSS, as many of the Central European emigres were in the area of research for the OSS, and he was the link between the OSS and the State Department in the planning of military government in Germany after the war. And so he came to take on a role. He was often in Germany. He was often consulted both by State Department and by those who were in charge of military government. And he did have a considerable influence, I think, in the restoration of some kind of relationship with Germany, in some of the reforms that took place in the German universities and so on. And in fact, when he died, he was in Bonn receiving an award for his role in the development of a new relationship between Germany and America.
Where did you do your undergraduate work?
I did my undergraduate work at Bryn Mawr College.
And what did you major in?
I majored in history with a minor in Latin and classics.
And what do you think you got from that education before you went on to graduate school? I mean, it sounds like you were an academic in preparation even before you did your undergraduate work.
Well, I think I was, except I didn't believe I was. That is, I thought I would never do what my parents and all their relatives did. I was not going to be a teacher. I was not going to be at a university. I was not going to marry an academic. I was not going to do the unromantic thing my parents had done, which was to meet in a Sanskrit seminar at the University of Berlin. So I ended up at Bryn Mawr thinking that I was going to be one of the world's great international correspondents or novelists, something of that kind. And then one night I went into the library as usual, and I realized I could do that every night of my life happily. And I realized also that I really loved studying history. And so my academic course was set, and despite all my vows, I met my husband in a seminar on the Middle Latin works of Erasmus.
So you put aside the convictions that you had before meeting him.
I did.
Right. And then where did you do your graduate work?
I did my graduate work first at Oxford on a Fulbright and then at Harvard.
And what was your dissertation on?
My dissertation was a study of 15th century humanists, Latin humanists, Italians who all wrote in Latin, and their views of history, the reasons you should study history, the lessons of history, and how to write history, and the way in which they made use of ancient sources in coming to these views. And there was a value orientation that was important in what they were writing and what they brought to the table as they were writing. There was. These were people who believed that history was above all the study of politics and war, that it was above all the narrative of the actions of great men, that the reasons for studying history were both because it was entertaining and you learned something from the narrative, but above all that it taught moral lessons, and that you learned from the past in order to help shape character and outlooks in the present and to do better in the future. And they had a strong view that history to some degree repeated itself and that therefore you could learn from it, and that the lessons above all were the lessons of an ethical sort. And it's not until Machiavelli that that view begins to shift and the lessons of history become the lessons of politics rather than ethics.
Now, you start off as a historian and you become an administrator over time. And I'm curious as to how being a historian helped inform these roles that you undertook as a pioneer woman, really, in university administration. The first, I believe, woman who was president of a major university. So did your background as a historian prepare you for that role in some way?
I think being a historian, you think in a certain way about the nature of institutions, about what has created not just institutions, but the particular situations that they find themselves in at any time, that you try to sort out what in that kind of historical creation is of lasting presence, has a lasting life, and what it is that perhaps has been less important over time. And I think that institutional understanding and the understanding of the relationship between people and institutions, and a certain sense for the complexity of life, and the fact that situations consist of lots of different things that have come together in a certain way, those are ways of thinking that I think come naturally to historians, and that I think certainly were helpful to me as I thought about administration or administrative issues.
You found yourself rising up from university to university. You were involved in. You were at Chicago. I
was teaching at the University of Chicago. Right.
You then got involved, and this is we should remind our audience, a very turbulent time for universities in
Yes.
terms of budgets, in terms of protest, in terms of the feminist movement and women's issues. So I'm just very curious how you move from history to these administrative roles. And I guess it's about being presented with problems and being able to deal with them. So at Chicago, where you were now teaching, you were involved in a controversial case about a tenure decision, I guess.
Well, it was actually about a reappointment decision, not
yeah.
even a tenure decision, the reappointment of an assistant professor. And the allegation at that time, this was, excuse me, this was in 1969, was that this woman who was not reappointed had not been reappointed because she was a radical, because she was a woman, and because she was a radical in her sociology, in the way in which she did sociology. Now, that was the particular match that lit a pyre that was ready to burn, because, as you know, at that time there were the protests over the war, there were new civil rights issues, there was the burgeoning feminism of that time, and so those issues got glommed together with this case in a certain way. But she became the symbol, and the administration building at the University of Chicago was occupied. The then president, Edward Levy, who later became Attorney General for President Ford, moved out of the building and appointed a committee and appointed me as chairman. And it's obvious why a woman was appointed as chairman at that time, I think. And asked us to look into this case and pledged to abide by whatever decision we came to. That is, if we decided indeed that inappropriate considerations had entered into the case, the university would abide by that. It was a very complicated case, and I did find that there was something enormously interesting in trying to figure it out. I mean, we ultimately came to the conclusion that there had not been inappropriate considerations, and that this particular person, in a way, was suffering from the fact that she never should have been appointed in the first place, that it was a kind of last-minute appointment. And so, in a way, she was not well treated because she was in a situation that she really couldn't quite handle. And so that was very sad. But I guess the committee also brought me a little bit more to the attention of people who were interested in finding people to do more administration. And so the next thing that happened was that I was asked to be Dean of the Arts and Sciences at Northwestern, which of course was a neighboring university and where I had done a little teaching, filling in for people from time to time. And for some reason it seemed interesting to me. We didn't have to move. I knew it was a place that I liked. I knew that if I didn't do well at deaning, I would enjoy being in that history department as I had at Chicago. And I found that it was a situation in which there was the opportunity to build something and to do something, and I found I enjoyed it.
And then you went on to Yale to be provost there, and then acting president when Kingman Brewster was appointed ambassador.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct.
I'm curious, because you were such a pioneer in women in these roles, to get a sense of the way in which that was an opportunity, but also it was a kind of a burden, because I think your distinguished career points to the conclusion that you were a great president who happened to be a woman, as opposed to being a president, because you would talk a little about that. What were the frustrations of being in this pioneering role?
Well, there were frustrations at various times. When I was a very young assistant professor, I was, of course, the only woman on the various programs that I was in at Harvard and so on. I wasn't allowed in the front door of the faculty club. I wasn't allowed in the undergraduate library for men, where my reserved book list was, and things of that kind. Those were somewhat frustrating. I dealt with the faculty club by going in the front door, even though I wasn't meant to, when I was attending a department meeting. And of course, people were much too polite to tell me to go out again. And the prohibition gradually, quietly went away. So one of the things I learned is that you shouldn't get too overexcited about issues where actually you can have an effect on changing. And the effect on changing does not have to be always that of a highly visible protest. It can sometimes simply be through actions that are then interpreted and taken seriously. But those were certainly frustrations. I was the only woman for a long time in the Association of American Universities. And I can still remember being told to put on a name tag, which I didn't want to do because I thought it would ruin, the pin would ruin a dress. And the woman said to me, "You've got to put it on because otherwise no one will know who you are." Well, in that, that kind of roomful, that's the comic side. That's the comic side of these kinds of things. When I was president, I was sometimes frustrated by the fact that the media wanted to emphasize only the fact that I was a woman. I mean, that was the storyline, that I was a woman, and I wanted often to talk about the university and not about this particular role. And while that gradually ceased, I did think that there was an overemphasis on that. Now, the wonderful thing is that now, in the AAU, you wouldn't be alone at all. There are lots of wonderful women who are presidents of universities. But along the way, the notion either that you had to give exclusive attention to women's issues. I mean, if you're president of a university, you're president for everybody. And it might be that as a woman, you have some greater sensitivity to certain kinds of issues and a greater determination to do something about them than you might if you were not. But surely you are responsible for the entire university. And in that sense, being a university president who happens to be a woman is, for me, the better way to think about it.
And just, I'm curious, what in your background prepared you to be such a pioneer? Was it the way you were treated as it didn't matter that you were a woman? I mean, the future they saw for you was what it was.
I think I had the very good fortune that my parents were completely supportive of my becoming a professional person, whatever it is. They sort of assumed that I would. That at Bryn Mawr, I had the very good fortune of seeing first-rate women working together with first-rate men. That faculty was probably about 50-50, and here were women and men working together in a women's college. And what they assumed was, again, that women were highly intelligent people who were going to do different things. So that was a huge help. A very supportive husband makes a huge difference. So from family and husband, from my undergraduate college. And then I actually had very good support from my professors at Harvard, who belonged to that male society and who were extremely supportive of my work. So I was fortunate at every point. And I think one other thing that helped me was that I was used to being a little different, just by virtue of having been a refugee youngster who was a little different from my American peers. And so I sort of learned a little bit to cope with some of the differences that you have. You are dressed differently, you talk a different language at home, all that kind of thing. And either you could want simply to conform, or you could somehow accept a slightly divided life in that way.
Let's talk now about being a president. What, if you were writing a job description, how would you sort of help us understand what skills are required to do that job?
I think I have to think about that carefully. I think you have to have the skill of being able to ask good questions, which may well be leading questions, like shouldn't we be thinking about this or that, without necessarily having come to the conclusion that we should, and with a genuine desire to learn from the people that you are consulting with, who are ordinarily wonderful faculty and faculty committees and so on, so that you can work that kind of thing through. But I think you have to have the skill of persuading people that those questions matter and that they really should be answered. And if they're going to be answered in a direction that perhaps you have suggested, that it is not because you've suggested it, but because others have taken possession of it. So I think you also have to understand that it's not you that does things. It is a group of people who ultimately are responsible for the outcome, and that you should not take some kind of false credit for that sort of thing. I think that, therefore, some arts of persuasion are important, some arts of advocacy are important. I think some tolerance of human folly is important, because you learn a lot of things about people that perhaps sometimes you just as soon not know. But you often are seeing people at their most distressed or at their most difficult. And you have to remind yourself that the academic world is a wonderful world in which you have to accept a huge range of behaviors and ideas and all the rest, and indeed take joy and satisfaction in the fact that they're all out there. So I think that you have to have a genuine love of the academic world with all its foibles and with all its promises, and a sense of mission about the importance, the long-term importance of education and scholarship and research, and the feeling that you are not, as it were, becoming the CEO of something, but that you are playing a role that is still a teaching role in some ways, in an academic world whose values you care about strengthening, sustaining, carrying forward. I think those are the, I don't know if those are skills or perhaps a set of values that I'm talking about finally, but I think those are very important.
Mm-hmm. You, as a chief executive or a leader, or I don't want to say coordinator, but in that role, you're focused in a way on preservation, preserving the best of the university, the traditions of disciplines and so on. But you're also at the cutting edge of innovation, because the university's role is to see new directions for research. And talk a little about that, because that's a hard mix there. It's
a hard mix, and the mix that you need is that combination of preservation and innovation. The combination of understanding what the values are of your institution and of this slice of the academic world, and at the same time of being ready to adapt to new opportunities and new circumstances in a way that does not change those values, but that moves the institution or its fields of learning or its disciplines of research further along. And the idea of change is, of course, very threatening, or felt to be very threatening in universities. And the idea that you might lose something is always very powerful. And yet you're dealing with people whose profession, as you indicated, is really that of moving the frontiers forward. And so, in some way, that combination is what it's all about, and what it is that where the arts of persuasion become important, to indicate that preserving the best of the past is at the same time translating it into what is possible in the future.
Mm-hmm. Now, since you've been president, you served on a number of boards of universities
Yes.
and corporations, and I'm curious, what is your sense of how leadership in universities, you know, differs from, say, leadership in the corporate world or, you know, other sectors of our society that you've been involved in?
I think people sometimes make that difference seem greater than it is. In other words, I think that to say that, well, a corporate CEO is top down, that's not what the modern corporation is any longer. And yet it is still true that the CEO of a modern corporation has an authority that a university president would never have. And that the whole idea of shared governance, which is at the heart of a university, is not at the heart of a corporation, no matter how much the corporation is oriented toward a good deal of decentralization, initiatives from below, and all the rest. So I think the difference is that in the one case of making shared governance work and of being able to, as it were, submerge some notion of authority and ego into the ideal of a shared governance, while at the same time taking final responsibility. And the CEO's world, in which the CEO of the corporation really does have a greater authority in the end, which comes in part even from most of them being chairman of their boards, as well as being seen not only as having the final say, but often of having a say without the kind of internal consultation I've talked about, although most CEOs would be in trouble if they behaved that way.
When you became president of the University of Chicago, let's talk about particular challenges. What was on your desk that you had to use this methodology we just talked about to deal with?
A number of things were on my desk. I became president in 1978. That was during the time of stagflation, when inflation was very high and investment returns were very low. It was, I mean, we were looking at double-digit inflation, for example. It was also a time when the huge burst of growth that had come to universities in the 60s especially had stopped. And in the 70s, federal funding was declining in real terms, and the capacity to grow had been rather abruptly put to an end, I think. It was a time when young PhDs were having difficulty in being placed and finding jobs. The academic marketplace was very poor. And it was a time when it was thought that the decline in the number of 18-year-olds that was imminent was going to have an enormous effect on enrollments in and competition among colleges and universities. So there were huge financial issues. The energy crisis had a huge impact, of course, on universities and their budgets. And there were these very difficult financial issues, but there was also the question, should our university, which had traditionally been an important graduate institution, which had really identified itself as much as a graduate as an undergraduate, perhaps even more as a graduate than undergraduate institution, how should it think about the future of graduate education? Should it continue to admit the numbers of students, for example, that it had? Did it have an obligation to be concerned about the waning numbers of opportunities for young PhDs? Should it be accentuating the undergraduate more or the other? So we had an issue about what we wanted the composition of the university to be, which also really went to the heart of the question, what kind of university are we? These were big questions, quite apart from all the financial and other issues, even though those may have helped to stimulate these. So we had an excellent faculty committee on the question of the size of the university and the balance between its different parts. I also created a commission on graduate education, feeling that we had rather rigid prescribed rules for how many courses any PhD had to have taken and so on, which had existed for, well, not for centuries, because we weren't even a century old at that point, but which had seemed to exist forever. And the Commission on Graduate Education, with which I interacted because I raised questions or suggested possibilities, but they came out with a wonderful report in which we not only recommitted ourselves to the role in graduate education that we had thought was ours, but in which we really revised, in many ways, made more flexible the PhD requirements, created a new system of graduate workshops, which has actually been quite widely taken up by other institutions over these past years, and had what I would call a really important discussion of the role of the university and what our goals and ambitions might be, and that also helped direct us toward the importance of securing greater graduate financial aid, even in difficult times, and so on and so forth. That, I think, that and the other committee that dealt with the relative balance of different areas of the university, professional, graduate, and undergraduate, were the two principal or initial ways in which I tried to do that.
As we confront a whole new set of problems, you know, in the present day, are there lessons that you derive from this experience that you're describing, namely, you know, really major challenges at the time you were in office? Are there lessons that you see applying to the current situation where, again, it's about budgets and portfolios and so on? I mean, clearly, in what you've told us about being a president, part of it is consultation, it's conciliation, but it's also kind of shaping a consensus about which direction you're going to go.
Well, I think it is. I think that every crisis we encounter, we always think is the worst. Is not to diminish the size of the current crisis, which is tremendous. I also think that the current crisis is grave not simply because of the abrupt decline in the resources available, but because over many decades, institutions have grown too large in what they attempt to do. I think they have simply assumed that growth is a perpetual thing that will come to them. I think they have simply added programs without reviewing programs that perhaps no longer have quite the importance that they once had. So actually, my view is that times of crisis, first of all, are rarely unique. Secondly, may have deeper roots than just the superficial, immediate reasons that cause them. And finally, are really occasions to do a major review, a deeper review, of an institution's purpose and priorities. That's a hard thing to do, very hard thing to do. It's very easy to talk about and very difficult actually to implement. But I think that if there's one lesson that I would derive from all of this is that we have such an opportunity right now. We have the need, which creates the opportunity. I also think that if you bring intelligent people together who really acknowledge the problem that exists, they're going to come up with some solutions. They're going to come up with a need to be more selective, or with the opportunity for setting some priorities and goals. And I think that in paring down some of what a university does, it might strengthen it and make it more focused and even improve quality.
So, as your fellow Chicagoan, Rahm Emanuel says, every crisis is an opportunity, I guess.
Well, I hate to seem to agree with Rahm Emanuel about almost anything.
How, in your, your, when you had a problem set to deal with, one of the big issues was raising money, as you said, and I'm curious, are there particular lessons about preserving the integrity of a place, what it stands for, the values, as you're going out to look for new sources of funding?
There certainly are. There are certain kinds of money you should never accept or never hope to get. And I think that obviously money is always a temptation, and the need for money is always tremendous. But there are simply kinds of money that it is better not to accept, either because it has the wrong strings attached or because it has the potential to create directions that aren't really the principal directions that you should be going in. Now, some of that comes from potential donors who have particular agendas, and they see the universities as good places for those to be fulfilled. They see the expertise of the faculty or a group of faculty at a university as just right for looking into the problem that interests them. But if it's not a problem that is really of first importance to the university, it's going to cost the university money, and it's going to divert it to a potential program perhaps that it would not really select. So I think that making hard judgments about restricted funds, how they are restricted and what they are restricted to, is a very important phenomenon of raising money. And unfortunately, it's harder and harder to raise unrestricted money, which is what universities need most of all for their operating costs.
Well, one of the challenges that I think we face in California, and it may be true throughout the country, is we have in these last decades been very concerned about the university being an engine for equalizing the society.
Yes.
And that was a precious goal, which is now being challenged because of the funding crisis. So, for example, state universities may need to recruit more out-of-state students who can pay higher tuition costs as a way to fund the enterprise at the cost of probably the middle class. Talk a little about that. I mean, you were at private universities, I understand, but equality was a goal, and even places like Chicago, making sure that people were given the opportunity when they couldn't afford it. But that seems like a very difficult set of challenges in today's world of higher education.
It is a difficult challenge. You know, the University of Chicago was historically a place where first-generation students came, not like the Ivy League, which already had a tradition of students. But in the 30s, many of the students at the University of Chicago were not living at the university. They were commuter students and so on, and they were the first in their families often to go to the university. So private universities are not necessarily different in that sense. And the University of Chicago obviously now, I mean, then it recruited from everywhere, but now, of course, it recruits still more broadly, and the proportion of students from our local area is smaller than it was. Financial aid has been the most important consideration in bringing more students of lower income background to the university, as to all universities. But there are very few universities wealthy enough to give financial aid large enough to solve this problem, I think. And more recently, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, they've all cut out the requirement for loans. They've all increased the income level at which people will qualify for financial aid, so they're trying to help that middle class problem at the same time. But some people are always on the other side of the line, and they're the people who feel that they are being asked in some way to subsidize the others. And that's a difficult problem. It is a difficult problem. I think that the level of tuition, which is being increasingly resisted, and which at the same time universities are counting on as unrestricted revenue in a difficult time, I don't think that can be sustained any longer, this considerable increase in tuition. And yet it's been tuition that has in effect subsidized financial aid. Somehow those things have to be pulled apart. I'm not quite sure how to do it. I'm not quite sure how to think about a program of national scope that would allow students more than the Pell Grants give them, and at the same time an opportunity to have a grant and take it to whatever institution they wish to attend, thus giving the institution also the need to provide financial aid, but at a level that's affordable. I haven't figured out how one does this, and there are obviously also now other priorities for our national government, but I do think that's going to be essential somehow, is to find a way to give grants to students. And I think students will, and I don't think it's wrong for students to have loans. The question is how much indebtedness they should have when they leave college. But I think for students to have some responsibility for their own tuition is not a bad thing either.
When you were still president, we were riding the first waves of globalization, and universities have always been sort of a cosmopolitan center of the American university. What do you think will happen in the future to the extent that new centers of power are rising and they want to draw on American universities to enhance their rise to power? Do you think that's going to be a problem for a university? That is, how it navigates servicing the world in a way beyond what it's been doing in the past, but without losing the focus on the skills and the centers of learning that we need here?
I'm not sure I understand the question quite.
Okay, maybe I don't understand it either, but I guess what the notion of universities opening foreign campuses,
yeah,
to essentially service the students abroad. Yeah, and that's what I'm sort of. Is there a threat there, or is it not something that we have to worry about?
I worry about it. I worry about it because I think that some of these campuses that are being opened in the Middle East are not just services to students in other countries, they're revenue generating, or at least it's hoped that they will be revenue generating. I think, secondly, that there are issues of quality. I think it's one thing to say that you're going to have the exact replica of quality and requirements of a program at home and abroad. I think it's rarely that that's really going to happen. I don't mean that it's always a bad thing, but I think that places are rushing into this too fast, and that the motives are not only the stated, perfectly good intentioned motives, well-intentioned motives of helping in another area, but I think they are revenue generating. And I'd be very careful about setting up a campus in a place where, for example, women are not welcome, really, or treated as full citizens. Now, some people would argue that to set up such a campus is to stimulate and enhance that process, but I'm not so sure. I think we've got enough to do without going out in the world and trying to do it. We've got these problems of access right at home.
Do you think it will be a challenge to preserve the liberal arts curriculum in places like Chicago? And what can we do about that? Can we, how do we fight to preserve the best of what was the liberal arts curriculum, which Chicago's was always one of the centers of?
Well, we continue, of course, to have and always will a liberal arts curriculum. And as you know, the number of students who take degrees in the liberal arts has declined and continues to. And in the current state of things, with the economic anxieties that exist, the pressure for a certain kind of vocational education becomes still greater. And I think one simply has to continue to press against that. And I think one reason for having good liberal arts colleges, whether in universities or freestanding, is to preserve that, but it's going to be harder all the time. I think people's anxiety right now over whether junior is really ready for the world of work and will find a job is overpowering. That's always been an issue. It's always been a part of our tradition, this questioning of what is the value of a liberal education. But I think we just have to keep reasserting a value that has to do with not simply the enhancement of civilized and cultural values and understanding, but that has to do also with the skills of thinking and of being able to see relationships out there, being able to deal with complexity and so forth in ways that the future, whose jobs we cannot even imagine, will require. And one has to keep making that case.
The research university in the future, what will it look like? I mean, clearly in this description of your own work at Chicago when you were president, there were a number of challenges, and you were able to come up with solutions that moved Research Chicago into the future. Do you see these research universities retaining their identity 25, 30 years down the road?
Well, I am not smart enough to know what the new university, what Chuck Vest called the mega-versity, is really going to look like. That is, what the ultimate consequences of technology are going to mean for university. Obviously, there'll be a global world of learning where the connections via technology and what it is that technology makes possible are going to be things that I can't even dream of. And that's going to have a huge effect on institutions. I think universities are going to have, by the nature of things, to be more collaborative with one another in areas of huge weight and expense, which of course include the natural sciences. I do not think that every research university can offer every field, let alone all the new fields that will quickly come into being in that area. So they're going to have to find new ways to collaborate, whether on a regional basis, whether through these technological resources or whatever. So I think that universities are going to have to give up some of their individual ambition in the service of this larger research or learning, while retaining a good deal of individuality in the kind of curriculum they present, in the fields or disciplines of scholarship that they decide to emphasize, and so forth. So on the one hand, I would like to see them more differentiated from one another, not all trying to do the same thing all the time. And on the other side, more collaborative and engaged in certain areas as part of a consortium rather than on their own.
Mm-hmm. As you look back at your career as a presidential leadership, what surprised you the most? What did you learn that, you know, in the course of doing the job that really surprised you?
I'm not sure that anything surprised me that much.
There were so many surprises.
The thing is, you're always going to be surprised, right?
Yeah.
So you're surprised not to be surprised. I think, however, I learned that certain things, how central they were. For example, I think the most important thing that a president does is choose good people. That's really the single most important thing that you do, is to choose good people as colleagues or whether you are helping in the recruitment or appointment of a first-rate person, and that the greatest satisfaction is to have appointed a really good person.
Mm-hmm. Your background, your father as this great historian, you have a sense of the dynamics of world politics, even though that you must. I'm just assuming that, and I'm just sort of curious to put that together with the fact that you sit on so many boards and have since you've left the presidency. What is your sense of the quality of American leadership generally in terms of confronting the global crises that we're going to be confronting, whether it's dealing with China, dealing with this rising powers beyond China, dealing with the environment and so on? Do you want to give us an assessment of whether American leadership, not just university presidents, will be able to adapt?
That's probably asking me more than I'm capable of making a judgment about. I think that there are a lot of excellent ideas out there. I don't see that we really have right now, or have had for some time, a way of thinking about foreign policy that is coherent. And I think that lack of coherence, I mean, obviously there's always the need to be reactive as situations arise and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, I think that there is a lack of coherence. And by coherence, I don't mean a kind of rigidity about what we would do or not do, but nonetheless a kind of set of mind about these large issues that individual leaders can participate in. I just don't think we have that. I think instead we have people with leading ideas, but I don't think that we really have the leadership that you're talking about. I think they're excellent individuals in the world of business as well as in the world of politics and universities and so on. But I don't see them as creating a kind of visible presence in our world right now. Do American universities have a role in filling that vacuum? I don't think that American universities should be trying to rule the world, change the world, tell the world what to do, or anything of the kind. They do have the role of giving an excellent education to the people who are going to make a difference. And I think that universities go wrong if they think that they're going to be the actors in those dramas. That's not what they're there for. But they should be providing the intellectual capital that is going to be used, that is going to make the difference.
One final question. How would you advise students who might watch this program, how should they prepare for their future?
Get a good education, and do not disregard the liberal arts, and do not rail against requirements if you have something like a core curriculum. You'll be surprised how later on you're going to be grateful for having had to learn that or study that.
Professor Gray, on that note, I want to thank you very much for coming to the campus, being the Kerr Lecturer, and being on our program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.